The movie Pulp Fiction is about the consequences of your actions. It's not judging, it's just observing. So I make the case in full in a separate video, so if that's what you're after, the link is below. But a movie never says a thing like that by accident, and it doesn't say it out loud either. So this video is about how this movie was actually constructed. And we're going to be looking at three different parts: the structure, the camera, and the dialogue, because this film makes a distinct and deliberate and sort of a slightly insane choice in all three. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, just a brief overview: Jules and Vincent are hitmen. Butch is a boxer who's paid to lose a fight and didn't. Marcellus Wallace is the man they all work for or owe. And it's told completely out of order, which is where we're going to start. So, the structure. And we're going to start with an obvious thing, which is that this film is out of order. And this wasn't invented with the film Pulp Fiction. Stanley Kubrick actually did it really well with the movie The Killing, which was made back in 1956. Now, this is a movie about a robbery at a racetrack, and what the movie does is it circles back to the same afternoon over and over and over again from the points of view of different characters in the film. Paul Thomas Anderson, great filmmaker and also a friend of Quentin Tarantino, he did a version of this with the movie Magnolia. Now, I love Magnolia. The one thing I'd say is I feel that movie's spread a little bit too thin. It has too many different threads competing for space, so each one feels like a tiny slice of meat on your bread, but you never really get the whole sandwich. But Pulp Fiction has three major character arcs, and that's part of the discipline of the movie. It has three arcs in a single frame, and each of these arcs has enough room when they can actually land. But here's the question nobody actually asks, and it's the one that really matters, is why? Because this thing, telling things out of order, it's not a gimmick. Watch what the reordering actually does. If you run this film chronologically in your head for a moment, you're going to start with Butch as a kid getting his dad's watch. Then we're going to go to Jules and Vincent in the morning. We're going to see the miracle, then we're going to have Marvin, the wolf, and then the diner. And then on to Vincent and Mia's night out, then we have the fight, we have Butch's day, we have Vincent dying, then we have the scene in the pawn shop. And it would end with Butch and Fabian riding out of Los Angeles on a motorcycle. And that would be a fine movie. But it's a completely different movie. Because in that version of the film, well, Vincent's death is sort of the climax of the story. It's the payoff. And then the film's delivering a verdict on him as a character. You were careless and here's your punishment. And then the movie becomes a morality tale. And if that's the case, well then the moment the film does it, you sort of stop believing in this world. But if you look at what Tarantino actually does, he puts Vincent's death in the middle, in someone else's chapter. It was an accident. Butch's story is about a watch. Vincent dying is something that happens while Butch is getting his watch back. No one comments on it. And then Butch puts the gun down and he leaves his apartment. And then when the film wraps, we're with Jules in the diner choosing not to kill someone else. And that's really the whole thesis rendered in editing. The consequence arrives, but it arrives sideways. It's off-center. It's in the middle of someone else's business. And the last thing you're left with isn't punishment. It's about a man deciding. So the order isn't just clever. The order is actually the whole argument. And credit where it's due. That's editing, and the editor is a lady named Sally Menke, who cut every Tarantino film until she passed away in 2010. He said, as in Quentin Tarantino, that she was his closest collaborator. And when we think of movies, especially of movies made by Quentin Tarantino, they sometimes get talked about like the director did the entire thing. But the reality is that someone sat in the editing bay with the director, and they crafted the film into what we know it is today. Onto the camera. So first we got to credit the cinematographer, which is a fellow named Andrzej Sekuła. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, this guy also shot Reservoir Dogs, and it's worth saying that this is a very different looking film than the later Tarantino movies, because from Kill Bill onwards, he's been working with Robert Richardson. Now, if you've watched this channel for 5 minutes, you know that Robert Richardson is my favorite cinematographer of all time. But these two men have an entirely different eye. Sekuła, his work is much flatter, it's a bit more harsh, and it's more saturated. It's much more like the 1970s exploitation films than the Robert Richardson films that Tarantino made later. And this is exactly right for the feeling of Pulp Fiction, because this is not a world that needs to feel as polished or even as dramatic as what we see with Robert Richardson's lighting. Now, let's look at three shots that are all doing the same job in different ways. First up is the hallway. This is where Jules and Vincent walk down a corridor in an apartment building arguing about foot massages, and the camera walks backwards in front of them the entire way. It's in the screenplay. Tarantino wrote Steadicam in front of Jules and Vincent. It's on the page. And American films at the time mostly didn't shoot like that. It's more of a European habit. And I just point to Jean-Luc Godard. He was part of the French New Wave, and this is a guy who used to do a lot of long takes in many of his films. And Tarantino's production company is actually called A Band Apart, which is a pun on Godard's Band Apart from 1964. So Tarantino is not hiding the reference. So what does this style of shooting in the hallway actually do? Well, it does a couple of things. The first thing is it makes the conversation feel unhurried. So it tells you that these two men aren't the least bit nervous about what they're actually in that building to do. And also, it makes us as the audience feel a little bit nervous because you know that the corridor has to end. Now, moving on to the wolf, we have a shot that's the exact opposite of that. When we meet Winston Wolfe for the first time, this is the cleaner that Marcella sends in, the camera is parked in another room entirely, and it's looking through a doorway from about as far away as you can get. His back is to us, so we never really see his face in that first scene. And in that particular scene, what the technique does, it's really the thing I find most interesting in this picture. Because when you take the face away, what you're forcing the audience to do is to listen. Because you've removed the thing that they normally read in a scene. You know, it's the eyes, the expression, the micro reactions. And that's all left to a voice and a body, and then in this case, the notes he's taken on paper. But this is really important. You're still watching, because film, first and foremost, is a visual medium. You know, if it were only about the words, you just listen to a radio play, or perhaps you go to see something on stage. The distance doesn't remove the image. It just changes your relationship to said image. And in this case, you're going to lean in. And then if we look at the scene with Butch, we have the exact opposite end of the lens doing exactly the same job. We have Marcellus's monologue, and in this case, we're locked in close on Butch's face, and we just hold it there. Now, Marcellus is entirely off screen. He's a voice, he's a hand, and an envelope. And Willis is so still, it almost feels like a freeze frame. Now, it might not seem like it at first, but we actually have the same instruction from the director. One time he achieves it by putting you across a room. The other time he achieves it by putting you 6 inches from a man's face. Both times, he takes you away from something so you'll pay attention to what's left. That's what camera distance is actually used for. It's not coverage, it's instruction to the audience about what to do with our attention. And then, of course, we have the trunk shot. We got to talk about this because it's a signature thing that Tarantino has used so many times. And in Pulp Fiction, he pops it in the first 10 minutes of the film. Jules and Vincent open the trunk of their car to load their guns, and we're inside the trunk looking up at the two hitmen. He did this in Reservoir Dogs, he does it here in this film, and as I mentioned before, he does it later in his career as well. But why does this technique work? Well, you're looking at them from the position of the thing that's about to be transported. It's a point of view no human being really ever has. And it's also, and I mean this as a compliment, it tells you that Tarantino is a guy who's watched a lot of movies and he's actively directing this one. And one piece of blocking we need to talk about, because it's the best directing in the entire film, and it has no camera movement at all. Vincent Vega is in a bathroom during every decisive moment in this movie. Mia finds the heroin, he's in the bathroom. Butch walks into his apartment, Vincent's in the bathroom. The diner gets robbed, Vincent once again is in the bathroom. And then when they're in the apartment picking up the briefcase, and the fourth guy comes into the room with his hand cannon, well, that guy comes out of a bathroom. So 4 times we have this bathroom, and the film never really points to it. That's really show don't tell at its highest level. The film uses a visual language instead of explaining to us what's happening. So what we see is that Tarantino is placing information in staging 4 different times, and then he trusts us as the audience to assemble this ourselves. Okay, so on to the writing, and this is really the part that everybody talks about 30 years later. And I think it's the part that people get a little bit wrong, because everyone says, oh my God, this is great dialogue, it's so quotable, and yeah, I'm with that, fine. But why does it work? And not why is it so cool, but more importantly, how does it actually serve the story? Because plenty of films have snappy lines and they kind of feel like garbage. But in this film it works because the dialogue, well, in some sense it's about nothing, because nothing is exactly what people really talk about. So 2 examples from outside the film. If you look at something like Breaking Bad, one of the reasons that show is so good is that it shows you that crime is mostly boring. You know, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of waiting around, there's a lot of sitting in cars, and then you only have about 90 seconds of unbearable intensity, and then you go back to being boring. So most crime films only show you that 90 seconds. And if you look at the film Fargo, there's a scene in a car where Steve Buscemi is trying to get his mute partner in crime to talk, and the other guy just simply won't engage. And that itself is really interesting, because now, as the audience, what we're asking is, do these men even talk? And if they do, what do they actually talk about? And that's the question Pulp Fiction answers for about 2 hours. Because we have our two contract killers, and what are they going to discuss when they drive across town at 7 in the morning? They can't sit there all morning and talk about, oh, so what's your favorite gun? And remember that guy we killed last time you were in town? Because no one lives like that. They're going to talk about the same nonsense that you and I talk about. You know, they talk about what they put on French fries in Holland instead of ketchup. They talk about what a quarter pounder is called in Paris, or whether a foot massage actually means something. That's how real people talk, which is why the characters in this film feel like real people rather than just functions of a plot. Now, let's move to the structural rule that lies beneath all of this. There's a thing that Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, talk about, and it's probably the best writing advice I've ever actually heard.
Our whole South Park writer's room, one whole wall is one of these. And we've got it split up into 3 acts.
We have different colored markers just like here too. Look at.
Yep.
We have that.
And I walk around with the markers like this, and we'll go, okay, we do a show about this.
This is our writer's room.
Oh, okay, well somewhere, okay, this would be a funny scene if we had this.
True.
Each individual scene has to work as a kind of funny sketch. You don't want one scene that's just like, well, what was the point of that scene? We've found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words and then belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but, right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And that, as soon as we are able to, and literally sometimes we'll write it out to make sure we're doing it. We'll have our beats and we'll say, okay, this happened, but then this happens, and that affects this, and that does to that, and that's why you get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that. And there's so many scripts we read from new writers and things that we see.
God, I see movies.
And
you see movies that you're just watching. And it's like this happened, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's when you're in a movie, just going, "What the f am I watching this movie for?" Just like this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. That's not a movie, you know. That's not a story. Like Trey said, it's those two, but because therefore, that gives you the causation between each beat, and that makes that's a story.
This happened, therefore he did that, but she reacted badly, therefore this happened. Well, now you got a story. And here's what's interesting. Pulp Fiction is scrambled. So on the surface, it looks like the biggest case of, and then, in terms of, how films are actually made. But that's not what's happening at all. Every single thing is a therefore or a but. Vincent shoots Marvin. Therefore, they need a garage. They need a garage, therefore Jimmy. Therefore the wolf. Butch wins the fight. Therefore he runs. Fabian forgets the watch. Therefore he goes back. He goes back. Therefore Vincent dies. He drives away. Therefore he hits Marcellus. And so on all the way throughout the entire picture. It just hands you the therefores out of sequence, and it makes you do the assembly. That's why this film rewards a second viewing so heavily. The first time you're following, the second time you're watching cause and effect that you already know the shape of, and it's quite terrifying. And one last note on the writing, which comes from the Scorsese conversation we had in a previous episode. What both these films share, in terms of Pulp Fiction and Goodfellas, is that they really feel like character-driven rather than plot-driven. It feels a little bit more like a European picture in that respect, because you're not watching people hit these points, like plot points on a schedule. You're actually watching real humans and the things that happen to them out in the world. So before we wrap up this video, it's worth talking about what the craft actually changed, because this film moved the entire industry. So to understand it, you got to go back to 1980 and a film called Heaven's Gate. The director was a fellow named Michael Cimino, and he just won Best Picture for the movie The Deer Hunter. If you haven't seen it, it is a kind of creepy and really gut-wrenching film, but it's well worth at least one watch. So anyway, post Deer Hunter, the studio essentially handed him the keys to the entire kingdom, and he drove the proverbial car off a 1,000-foot cliff. Heaven's Gate went so far over budget and it lost so much money that it actually took United Artists down with it. And just for those movie nerds of you out there, this was a company that was started by Charlie Chaplin. So this movie, being Heaven's Gate, is the reason that the auteur era of the 1970s came to an end. And after that, power really moved out of the director's chair and into the executive suite. And it stayed there for most of the 1980s. But that's the world Pulp Fiction walks into. Tarantino links up with a small distributor, Miramax, and then we have a writer-director that no one had really heard of till 2 years prior. He only had about an $8 million budget. He didn't have any stars in the conventional sense. But then he went on to win the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and it made over $200 million worldwide. It got 7 Oscar nominations. And Tarantino and his writing partner, Roger Avary, they actually won the Academy Award for the screenplay. And just picture that, the 1990s, $200 million off just a normal script. There's no franchise, there's no effects, there's no movie star's face on a poster. It was just a really great film. And then every executive in Hollywood took the same lesson. We get a small company, we find a writer-director with a voice, give them a modest budget, and then just get the heck out of the way. And that was really the independent film boom of the 90s, which all started with Pulp Fiction. And then everyone tried to copy it. For about a decade, you couldn't really get away from what we saw in this film. You had all these movies with criminals having these long, meandering, sometimes funny sort of conversations about nothing before the violence actually begins. Michael Bay, he tried a version of this in Bad Boys. Guy Ritchie has built an entire career on sort of a British version of this. And there's hundreds of other films that you've probably never heard of that open with a couple of hitmen in a car talking about, cereal or something else. But almost none of it worked, and here's why. They copied the surface. They thought the point was that criminals were chatty and the timeline should be scrambled. But the reason it works here is that the dialogue is doing character work and the scrambling is doing the thematic work. If you take those away, you've just got people killing time on screen. And just to put it into perspective, have a look at The Godfather. Now, this is one of the greatest films ever made, but how much conversation in that film is about anything other than business? Now, there is this one scene where Clemenza teaches Michael how to make pasta sauce. And honestly, that's really about as far as it goes. Everything else in that movie is about the operation. Same with the movie Goodfellas, which we just covered. It's an extraordinary film, but those men only talk about work. And then Pulp Fiction comes along and it spends 5 minutes just talking about foot massages, and then 5 more minutes talking about the metric system. That was really new, and films have been borrowing it for a generation and a half now. And this sort of non-linear thing became so common that people forget that it was strange at the time, which is its own kind of legacy because the technique has become invisible. And that's not a failure. That's the technique and these ideas being absorbed into the film business and sort of the culture more generally. And Tarantino said something about this that I think about a lot. The point of making a film out of order was that audiences would follow it. You don't treat audiences like they're stupid. That's a directive, not a technique. And an awful lot of what's wrong with modern studio filmmaking is that, the people don't really believe it. They think you have to force feed audiences instead of letting us as viewers do some of the thinking while we're watching the film. So that's the craft of Pulp Fiction. We got the 3 arcs cut out of order on purpose, a camera that moves you in close or moves back depending on what it wants you to pay attention to, and then we have dialogue about absolutely nothing that is doing everything. And here's the thread running through all of it. Every single one of those choices is a choice not to explain. The order of the film refuses to deliver a verdict. The camera takes something away so you'll lean in. The writing hands you causes out of sequence and makes you assemble them yourself. So Tarantino trusts us to do the work as the audience. That's the entire method. And that's really show don't tell at the highest level of construction. If you want to break down on the performances in this film and how they all came together, there's a link in the description below. And also, if you want to know what this film is actually saying underneath all of this, we have a link for that too. I'm Eddie P. I will see you next time.